Spying, our speaker notes early in his book, is as old as history. But somehow in the US, the public forgot about it for a while, certainly vis-a-vis Russia after the Cold War. Russian interference in the 2016 US elections came as a wake-up for many of us. Arguably, the West has been playing catch-up since then, as apparently it has done in its espionage rivalry with the East many times before. Why is that? Do different systems handle espionage differently? Have we learned anything about ongoing challenges? And by the way, are there any lessons for the newer intelligence rivalry with China? So taking advantage of recently uncovered archives, tonight's speaker, Calder Walton, has taken on these and other questions. So good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Chat and Chowder. My name is Mary Eintema. I'm president of World Boston, and we're delighted that you're joining us either here in the room or on the Zoom. Before we get started, a few reminders. As you may know, the mission of World Boston is to foster international engagement and global cooperation. So we thank you for taking part in this mission. Right away, thanks to our hosts at Foley Larder for sharing this beautiful venue. Thanks to Natalie Mace, who, along with other great World Boston colleagues, is making everything happen. World Boston staff and board members, raise your hands. Everybody else, come and talk to us because we love to talk to you. Of course, we thank the Lowell Institute, which supports Chat and Chowder and Great Decisions, as well as our annual State of the State Department program. The Lowell Institute makes it possible, you know what's coming, for regularly monthly global engagement programs to be free for all attendees, but free of charge does not mean free of cost. The programs take a lot of resources. Fortunately, supporting World Boston at $25 and above will get you this very stylish pin, as well as entry into our 2024 Circle of Community Supporters. So just think for a second about what you would pay for a lecture or a bottle of beer or a bowl of soup, and pitch in if you can with one of those nice QR codes that's floating around. Shout out to people who recently pitched in, Madison Vickery, Harper Vickery, Alan Cleveland, and Keith Sonia. Also want to mention Josie Dent, who is reporting on tonight's event for the Simmons Voice. We'll post her recap on our website soon. Next, upcoming events, June 3rd, we look forward to, there you go, hosting our next Great Decisions on NATO's future with members of our local consular corps, Dr. Sonia Kreibich of the German consulate, and Mustafa Soykert, French consul general in Boston. Following week, June 11th, June is big, we'll be back here for Chat and Chowder with Stephen Cook on his new book, The End of Ambition, America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East. And big news, if you read the newsletter today, save the date, June 25th, a really big deal from the State Department, and also Super Speaker, Deputy Secretary Richard Verma will be talking about the state of the State Department and national security, this year's installment of our annual signature event. All right, so you can learn more and register for all of these programs using the QR codes or visiting our website. Finally, note on housekeeping, when we turn to the audience Q&A, please raise your hand, and when I call on you, a colleague will bring you a mic so you can ask your question, which ends with a question mark. We'll also try, hello Zoom, we'll also try and get a couple of questions from Zoom and read a couple out loud. I do believe more people are going to be filtering in because transportation is a giant mess. So make them welcome, make room, and we'll just keep going. And now, at long last, tonight's program, we're thrilled to be joined by Calder Walton. I'll abbreviate his bio, or try to, but it's compelling and you can read it in full on the website. He's Assistant Director of the Applied History Project and Intelligence Project at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. He's one of the world's leading experts on the history of intelligence, national security, and geopolitics. His research and commentary appear frequently in essentially all the major outlets. Calder is also general editor of the multi-volume work Cambridge History, Cambridge History of Espionage and Intelligence, and his first award-winning book, Empire of Secrets, British Intelligence, the Cold War, and Twilight of Empire. Now, I'm pulling this in from his website because it's cool. While pursuing a doctorate and postdoctorate fellowship at Cambridge, he was also a principal researcher on the authorized history of Britain's security service, which gave him privileged access to MI5's, is that how you say it, MI5? Yes, MI5's 100-year secret archives. He's also a qualified attorney, so right at home here at Foley and Lardner. And how about this? Also a distinction in some way. In February, Calder, among other British officials and historians, was formally sanctioned by the Kremlin for demonizing Russia and inflaming the war in Ukraine. It's a big responsibility. Anyway, with that, please welcome Calder Walton.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mary. Thank you to World Boston Book, Chat Chowder. I hope everyone's got their chowder, and I hope this will be a good chat. Thank you, Mary, for introducing me and making this possible. Thanks to Natalie back there for answering all my emails, for this law firm for hosting the event, and to board members and the Lowell Institute. It's really a privilege to be here. What I thought I would do in the next 20 minutes or so is to give some of the key conclusions of my book, which took 7-8 years to do, as my long-suffering wife here will testify. Here are just some of the headlines that caught my eye from the last week or so about spies and espionage and national security. That's on the BBC website at the top there. 2 British men charged with helping Russian intelligence allegedly conduct sabotage operations inside Britain. There's a good report that came out, authored by Michael Weiss and some of his colleagues in The Insider, about some Czech deep cover so-called illegals. I highly recommend that report if you haven't seen it. And there's the New York Times and similar articles from the FT saying that China's spies are popping up all over Europe all the time. It's much in the news, from election interferences, as you just said, Mary, through to these headlines. But it seems to me, ladies and gentlemen, that the news stories frequently, often lack their proper context. And without understanding that context, seems to me my assertion is that you can't really understand what's going on in the news today. So the book, as I said, took 7 years or so to write, and it's quite a weird thing to be able to, or be forced to sort of distill that down to three points. I've learned that being at the Belfer Center and then going down to Washington, D.C. a fair bit, that policymakers in Washington like 3s. They don't like 4s. They like just 3s. 3's just that sweet spot. So there you go. I've condensed it down to 3 points. And here they are. The Cold War started much earlier than we often suppose, certainly than I learned in school when I was learning about it for the first time. Secondly, contrary to what certainly appeared to be the case in the West, the Cold War did not finish nicely and neatly in 1991. But as far as the Kremlin was concerned, spilled on over. And it's that messy aftermath of the Cold War that we are seeing play out in the news each day. And thirdly, the geopolitical clash today between East and West constitutes a new Cold War, and intelligence agencies, both in the East and in the West, are once again at the front line. There are echoes and continuities of Cold War 1.0, as I think it's fair to say, to Cold War 2.0, but there are also key differences, and I'll be coming to those in turn. So I'll take each of these points in turn in the next 20 minutes or so. When I was at school, I learned that the Cold War started in the sort of pivotal years of 1947 or 1948. That's the moment of the Iron Curtain, that's the moment of the Truman Doctrine, and so on. This is the sort of the big strategic moments that we learn about at school. And there's much to that. But when you start to look at it from the perspective of Soviet intelligence, and particularly former secret archives smuggled to the West from KGB archives, it begins to look very much different. I would argue that the Cold War effectively started in 1917, when the Bolsheviks seized power in Moscow, and then crucially, in the years following, when the Western allies, including the United States, which many people, even dare I say it, undergraduates I speak to at the great university I'm part of, Harvard, don't know that the Americans intervened in the ensuing Russian Civil War. At that moment, the Bolsheviks and the Western powers were effectively on a collision course. That collision didn't express itself until the post-war years after 1945. But it actually, to understand what happened in those years, you need to trace it further back. Soviet intelligence was at the forefront, at the coalface of this geopolitical clash from the outset. Soviet intelligence in the 1920s and 1930s was simply far more sophisticated than anything Western powers, Britain or the United States, had in their arsenal in terms of intelligence and national security. Soviet intelligence was able to exploit the recruitment of ideologically committed agents on both sides of the Atlantic, in Britain and in the United States. Fellow travelers who believed in what I think is fair to call the myth image of the Soviet Union, squinting from afar, from the safety of Cambridge college rooms and so on. They believed in the myth image of Stalin's Soviet Union and that it was the best defense against rising fascism in Europe. A series of graduates on both sides of the Atlantic were skillfully recruited by Soviet intelligence officers. I'm thinking in particular here of the 5 Cambridge spies, and there are their pictures in the middle and the bottom there. This is Donald MacLean, Guy Burgess, H.A.R. Kim Philby, Anthony Blunt, and the missing 5th man, whose identity was the source of turmoil for 30-odd years, John Cairncross. 4 of the 5 were graduates of my old college in Cambridge, Trinity College, Cambridge. The scholars, like myself, and fellows of Trinity, we like to say that the college has produced more Nobel Prize winners than the entire history of France. Always good to measure against France. What we don't like to say is that the college has produced more traitors than any other British academic institution. Thanks to their recruitment in the 1930s, either at or soon after they left Cambridge University, Stalin and his intelligence chiefs were given a ringside seat during the Second World War in key strategic decisions being taken in London and Washington about the Soviet Union itself. During the Second World War, when the Soviet Union was pulled into the war with the Nazi Germany's attack in June 1941, the British Foreign Office, in all of its majesty, decided that now the Soviet Union was part of the war, that there would be no more offensive British intelligence collection on the Soviet threat. Why did they do so? We've got the memo, and the permanent undersecretary at the Foreign Office, Alexander Cadogan, says, because allies don't spy on allies. Wonderful to be that thinking that way. Totally naive, it seems to me, in terms of international relations. And so much of the damage that was revealed in the post-war years with successive Soviet spy scandals after 1945 could have been revealed, it seems to me, if there had been a little bit more spying on allies. Of course, Stalin and his intelligence chiefs showed no such gentlemanly restraint and actually used the moment when the Western allies were dealing and geared towards wholeheartedly towards the defeat of the Axis powers. Stalin used that moment to go on the offensive and to steal as many scientific and technical secrets as possible from the Western powers, with the intention of being able to use that science and technology against the Western allies in what he viewed as the inevitable, according to his reading of Marxism, struggle with the Western powers after the Second World War. The Soviet intelligence archives reveal that this was a broad swathe of intelligence collection targeting missile defenses, aeronautics, across the defense secretary, all the while when the Western allies, as I said, were allies with the Soviet Union. But the most extreme and the most important intelligence target was the Anglo-American atomic bomb project. If you haven't seen the film Oppenheimer, I highly recommend doing so. It's a really extraordinary piece of cinematography. The film does quite rightly, there are, yes, certainly some inaccuracies, and it's very easy to sort of, for me as a professional historian, to take pot shots at the film. That's not really the purpose. If it convinces anybody to go read the biography, the brilliant biography of Oppenheimer, so much the better. The film does correctly portray one Soviet spy operating at the heart of the Los Alamos Manhattan Project. That's Klaus Fuchs, German emigre. His MI5 dossier, where that photo is taken from, is now declassified. Happy to talk about that how it was that Fuchs managed to worm his way into the Manhattan Project in Q&A afterwards. But suffice to say that he provided essential secrets about the Manhattan Project to his Soviet handlers. It meant that by the end of the Second World War, Fuchs and other agents inside Los Alamos had delivered the secret plans for the atomic bomb to his Soviet handlers. This allowed Soviet scientists to accelerate their own research and development for their atom bomb project. And it meant when the Soviet Union, 4 years later, in 1949, detonated its own atomic weapon, it was an exact replica of that dropped by the United States on Nagasaki. This is the essence, it seems to me, of scientific and technical intelligence collection by a hostile state, allowing for research development projects perhaps already underway to be accelerated. It allowed Soviet scientists to simply avoid all of the pitfalls that they had made at the Los Alamos Project. We mentioned before the Venona decrypts, a series of decrypt Soviet telegrams that were decrypted in the post-war years about the scope and scale of Soviet espionage during the war. They reveal, ladies and gentlemen, that over 200 American citizens spied for Stalin during the Second World War. Many of the Soviet agents who are not known by they are not identified in the decrypts, but it's only through careful cryptanalytical research that their identities can be established. But many of them have never been identified, at least publicly, and I'm confident to say also within agencies on either side of the Atlantic. If anybody listening is looking for an exciting research project to do, actually using new artificial intelligence capabilities to look back at the Venona decrypts here would be an extraordinary opportunity to do something really interesting. I'll leave it at that. Perhaps we can come back to that in more detail. All of this meant that, as I said, in the post-war years, thanks to his spies in the West, the Cambridge spies operating in Washington and in the atom bomb project, it meant that Stalin was able to look, in the post-war years, he was given a ringside seat to essentially the major decisions that both governments, the British and the Americans, took as the Cold War settled in. I wanted to include this picture here as the kind of the documents that are available in declassified British records. This document here, I think if I was to guess, is probably the document and the bit of the book that caused me to get sanctioned by the Russian government. Within the Soviet and now Putin's Kremlin's narrative of their master spy, Kim Philby, one of the Cambridge spies I mentioned, the linchpin of the network in many ways. Within the Kremlin's narrative, Philby, two of the members of the network, McLean and Burgess, defected. They disappeared in May 1951, and the hunt was on for who else was in the network. Kim Philby knew that his close association with those two missing diplomats would soon cast suspicion on him. And in the Kremlin's narrative, what he managed to do was to fend off all of the British investigations and interrogations for over a decade later, until in 1963 Philby himself defected. This document explodes that myth. In the aftermath of the disappearance of the two members of the network, Burgess and McLean, Philby writes to the director. So at the time Philby was working for MI6, he was actually liaison officer for MI6 in Washington, right at the apex of transatlantic intelligence and security relations. He writes to his boss in MI6 and the director general of MI5, and he presents it as that he is being extremely helpful to them. That, I've just remembered actually, being friends with Burgess, there are actually some things about his career and how we interacted that makes me think that perhaps he may be a Soviet agent. And perhaps actually the disappearance of Burgess and McLean, maybe one of them even recruited the other at Cambridge. What's he doing here? He's throwing his two Soviet agents, fellow Soviet spies, under the bus. He knew full well in this document that it was actually him, Philby, who recruited them. Now, this is a narrative, a chapter in Philby's espionage and treachery that the Kremlin doesn't want out. It reveals Philby's true nature. He lied to everyone. He lied to his colleagues in MI6. He lied to his fellow Soviet spies, his countrymen, his two fellow Soviet spies, and he also lied to the KGB. It's little wonder that when Philby defected in 1963, it took the KGB 14 years, ladies and gentlemen, to actually invite him into their headquarters. They didn't trust him, and it was probably because they got wind of what he was doing in this document here. So it's quite easy, and I've already had a discussion, one question about what does all this mean? And it's quite easy when writing about spies and espionage and counter-espionage to get lost in a rabbit hole of, well, this person knew that and that person knew that, and it's smoke and mirrors. But I think when we zoom out, it is possible to try to answer the so what question. What difference did it actually make? Well, ladies and gentlemen, intelligence was certainly played a crucial role in the acute moments of the Cold War. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, we can now see how human intelligence from Britain's MI6 and the CIA, from an agent inside Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, how his espionage fed through into the assessments that were given to President John F. Kennedy during the crisis. And also, crucially, we can now see the role of technical intelligence, decrypts, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But more generally, I think that there's probably the most significant contribution that Western intelligence and indeed Soviet intelligence played during the Cold War was to help stabilize that conflict. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet and NATO governments in the US signed a series of arms limitation and reduction agreements. Those agreements would not have been possible. They would have not been effective if it had not been for intelligence collection on both sides. In the treaties of arms reduction treaties, they expressly refer to national technical means, or NTMs. National technical means, that's a euphemism for technical intelligence collection, signals intelligence, and imagery intelligence from overhead reconnaissance and satellites. Both sides of the conflict, in other words, acknowledged that they would be collecting intelligence, collecting intelligence on each other to monitor each side's arsenal. Obviously, without that intelligence collection, you don't know whether an adversary is adhering to the agreement. This is, it seems to me, a significant dog that doesn't bark, and it hasn't been recognized in the existing scholarship of the Cold War as it should be. So, turning to my second point now, that the Cold War didn't end nicely and neatly, at least as it appeared to us in the West at the time. As far as the Kremlin was concerned, the Cold War spilled on over in 1991. The KGB was officially disbanded, becoming a domestic service within Russia, the FSB, Federal Security Service, and a foreign intelligence service, the SVR. The names changed, they turned into different three-letter agencies, but very little else changed. Same officers in many cases, same tradecraft, same records. In some cases, and this is a really underappreciated chapter of American-Russian relations after 1991, the Russian government simply picked up and continued running the same agents inside the US government. I'm thinking here of Aldrich Ames inside the CIA and Robert Hanssen, I think, who passed away last year, inside the FBI. One FSB, Russian Security Service officer, defector, told me that, and he went through training in the late 1990s, that when he was going through training, they used the KGB's old tradecraft manuals, but they'd simply ripped out the bits about ideology, about Marxism and communism, and they said, we don't need to worry about that anymore, but the essence is still there. So a continuity there. And it's out of that continuity that Putin emerges. Both, Putin's made much of his KGB career stationed in East Germany. Happy to talk about that in Q&A. In the early 1990s, he worked in the regional government, provincial government of Leningrad, and then, to everyone's surprise, probably including himself, he became FSB director in 1998, and then Yeltsin made him his successor in 1999. Much has been written about, 5 more minutes, much has been written about Putin and his KGB career. I think that what is not been adequately acknowledged in the existing literature is Putin's connections with Russian organized crime, and indeed the connections between Russian organized crime and the security agencies in Russia. The FSB, it is completely and utterly wrong to think of the FSB as in any way analogous to the FBI or MI5. The FSB, under Putin, operates as a mechanism for massive money laundering and organized crime. That's what its purpose is to do. I'm aware I've only got five more minutes. So let's turn to the third point right now, which is that we are in a new Cold War, and it is with Russia, and it is even more importantly with China. Russia and China announced their agreement to the world on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, when Xi and Putin announced their alliance with no limits, and it seems to have an intelligence component to it. The Chinese Communist Party's long-term strategy after 1991 was to displace, and is to displace, the United States as the predominant power in Southeast Asia. And under Chairman Xi, that has become only more acute. To make a long story short, what I've been able to discover conducting interviews for this book was that China's intelligence conflict with the West started much earlier than we tend to imagine. It started actually as early as 2005. This was a moment when Western policymakers were seeking to embrace China as a responsible player on the international stage. In fact, if you look at, if you understand the Ministry of State Security, with the MSS, which is essentially their equivalent of the KGB, in 2005, the Ministry of State Security declared war on the US intelligence community. They did so with, according to a strategy in Chinese of Geian Guanhou, which can be translated as watch the fires burn from the safety of the opposite riverbank, which allows you to avoid entering battle until your enemy is exhausted. This was a moment when the United States was mired in counter-terrorist operations in the Middle East, and both the CCP and Putin saw this as an opportunity to go on the offensive. for the Chinese intelligence services to start stealing as many scientific and technical secrets as possible from Western commerce and defense industries. There's a direct parallel, it seems to me, here with the Second World War. The US government is very good about doing one thing at one time. We're less good at doing several things at one time. In other words, during the Second World War, the overwhelming priority of defeating the Axis powers. During the war on terror after 9/11, overwhelming priority given to counterterrorism, whereas hostile states, Russia and China, necessarily melted into the background. A plug for the Applied History Project that I helped to run here, and the seminal work that really we are following in the footsteps of, a book by Richard Dick Neustadt and Ernie May, Thinking in Time. And this is a book about how history can be used for policymakers, how it can be useful. And one of the key ways that it can be used is to start off with a predicament, a decision today, or a situation today, look to the past, and then simply get a piece of paper and divide it into two, and to say there are similarities and differences. That's a rather pedestrian way of doing it, but actually I find it to be quite useful. There are some key similarities with Cold War I and Cold War II. There's a nuclear standoff. The nature of the Cold War, with a phrase coined by George Orwell in 1945, soon after the dropping of the bombs on Japan, he quite rightly recognized that in this new conflict with atomic weapons, neither side would be able to go to a hot war if both sides of these super monstrous states, he called them, were equipped with nuclear weapons. They would be able to blow themselves up. So the Cold War had to stay cold. It couldn't stay hot. We're in the same situation, it seems to me, today, although all eyes are on, of course, Putin's nuclear saber rattling. There's an ideological component as well about the future of the world order, certainly in Cold War 1.0, and it seems to me in Cold War 2.0. But there is a key difference as well, and that is China's massive economic weight. The Soviet Union was just never an economic power like China is today. And then there's, of course, and I'm drawing to an end here, the new nature of how intelligence and national security operates today compared to even the very recent past. So this century, we are witnessing and we're living through a revolution in intelligence and national security through open source or commercially available intelligence, which simply makes even the recent past look very, very different. And this century's Cold War, it seems to me, will be about three things. It will be about artificial intelligence, it will be about synthetic biology, and it will be about quantum computing. It will also fundamentally be about data, and whoever can master data and process it the best will be masters of this century. And I'll leave it there, and we can open up to questions if you like.
All right, thank you so much, Calder. I know we're going to have a million questions, and we're going to start with I've dubbed this, it's always this zone, the World Boston Brain Trust. So let's, you know what, I think we're going to take two at a time just to get more in. So we'll do Ed and then Henry, okay?
Thank you for your talk. In 2000, World Boston actually went to CIA headquarters in McLean there.
Oh, great.
And all they talked about, this is before 9/11, all they talked about was Russian crime families.
Yep.
And I'd be curious, you spoke a little bit of that, how much is it, how much is just simply just out and out theft and greed what the FSB is doing versus, you know, an ideological, you know, national interest thing?
No, great question. Thank you
Okay,
for that.
and then we'll go over to Henry.
Sorry, yeah.
You had just made reference to China's inclination to capitalize on spying Western countries. With that in mind, will you talk a little bit about the spy balloon and the context?
Yeah, great. Thank you. So, first question: how much of the FSB's work is driven by ideology, or is it just through and through theft? Well, it depends on what you mean by ideology. The ideology is Putinism, that he is looking above all to solidify and to secure his own rule. it's a one-man rule. The ideological component, of course, of the Cold War 1.0 communism doesn't exist anymore, and actually Russia's oligarchs are the living embodiment of anti-communism. It's crime through and through, money laundering. So the ideology is Putinism. What does Russia actually stand for is a deeper question lurking behind your question. It seems to me that Russia, in the past and today, their grand strategy is essentially, as long as Western powers, particularly the great enemy, the United States, as long as Western powers are doing badly, by default, Russia is doing well. That seems to be the permeating grand strategic thinking of Kremlin leaders. And that's in sharp contrast to the Chinese Communist Party, which is actually proactively, positively giving an alternative version of world leadership against the United States. So the ideology for Russia seems to be negative. I point you in the direction of a report by the Atlantic Council, which goes into great details, about 2 or 3 years old now, about Russian organized crime and how the FSB facilitates that. Again, FSB defectors have told me that it's not just a question of 1 or 2 people being on the take. Everyone is on the take. There is, if you are not on the take in the FSB, you stand out like a sore thumb. And all of that, Putin tolerates that. He allows it to happen. All knowing that if just like he can just turn on the light switch and charge someone with corruption because everyone's corrupt. It's the ultimate way that he can fell opponents, and there's echoes of that in the CCP as well. Spy balloon, it blew up. When was that? A year and a bit ago. On the one hand, extraordinary that we're back using balloons as spying, but I'm also reliably told that some of the technical capabilities within the spy balloon were anything but 19th century as the balloon itself looked. I think more significant is at about the same time as the spy balloon with news reports, credible news reports that China, the CCP, Ministry of State Security, was activating a significant intelligence base in Cuba. And this was actually, talk about a continuity with the first Cold War, this was an old Soviet intelligence, massive signals intelligence capability with antenna directed at Florida, the Florida shores, at Miami air bases and so on. And the CCP, the Chinese intelligence, both PLA, military intelligence and the Ministry of State Security are allegedly taking over a similar facility in Cuba. So those are just 2 examples, but the thing is that they are 2 amongst many, many more examples of offensive Chinese intelligence collection, not necessarily focusing on classified information, on state secrets, but they collect rather information. It can be both publicly available information and classified secrets. And then the task is, once having amassed all of that data, then they will process it and do who knows what with it. And that's where we're at the moment. So I see that in the West, we are, as you quite rightly pointed out in the beginning of the talk, we're essentially in a racing to catch up, as we're in a process of damage limitation in terms of China and how China has gone on the offensive while all of our resources have been diverted elsewhere, particularly with counterterrorism. One chilling statistic that I discovered writing the book was that in 2006, the same year when the FSB, probably at Putin's direction, assassinated a former a defector, a Putin critic, Alexander Litvinenko, in London. That same year, 2006, MI5's workload was 95% geared towards counterterrorism and only 5% dealing with hostile state activities. That's to include China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, to state the obvious. So just 5%. So something seriously imbalanced there. Out of necessity, in other words, the needle is so in the red in terms of counterterrorism, there just simply it wasn't the resources. But I think in the cold light of day, upon retrospective analysis, we can see that was woefully misguided. And as I said, we're now racing to catch up.
Okay, thank you. I want to mention that if you are new to World Boston, if you're a student, I would love to get your question, and I'd love to get other people's questions too. Worry not. But let's go to, I see you. Let's go to Zoom, and then we'll come back into the room. Go ahead, Naz.
So this question's from Linda Schindler. How accurate was the TV show The Americans, which was about a Russian man and woman who were trained as spies and placed here in the United States as a married couple?
Yeah. Great question. Thank you, Linda. Accurate. They had some excellent historical advisors. I know some of them who helped frame that show. Yes, the storylines in particular episodes were not, to the best of my knowledge, actually fact-based, but the general principles, yes, certainly. And they are essentially what we're talking about here, are deep cover illegals, Russian illegals. Illegals meaning not attached to a diplomatic, to the Russian embassy or consulate, which would give intelligence officers legal or diplomatic cover. So if you're if you're an intelligence officer of any country and you're operating out of an embassy, if you are arrested by the host country, you can claim diplomatic immunity. Illegals were and are out in the cold. They are operating without diplomatic cover. All countries, we were reliably told, do this. In the US, it's called non-official cover. But a key difference is that, so far as I know, non-official cover operatives for the CIA still operate under their own names. They don't do what the Soviets did in the past, starting in the 1920s, and Russia does today, which is to live under a so-called legend and create a false narrative, a false persona. And that's what the series of Russian illegals, some of whom were based here in Boston and Cambridge, who were rounded up in 2010. That's what they were doing, which I think might segue to your question.
All right, so we'll go to Martin and then to Mary.
So, yeah, my question is about the illegal in Cambridge, who probably was most likely the most person model for the Americans.
Donald Heathfield, is it? Or
Heathfield, yeah. and Tracy Foley. And so right after they were arrested, I went up to their bedroom and I picked up a movie. And so this is getting to my point, which is there's always a backstory. There's always so much more. Yeah. And a couple of years after the Spies got back, Tracy Elena wrote a fiction, and she referenced this book, and I'll call out to the French a little bit, Sylvia Crystal. This is Emmanuel, the soft porn movie that she writes about in her book. And what I'm really getting at, and I'm going to ask to push you back a little bit, is particularly when we're talking about political intelligence, there's so much backstory and so much going on. How much of it can policymakers really act on? And don't a lot of policymakers do what they were inclined to do anyway?
No,
Great. And so should we go to another one, or you want to do one at a time?
Let's do one at a time.
All right.
It's an
and then we'll
absolute,
come to Mary.
essential question. What is, all said and done, what is it that an intelligence agency of any country, what is it that they can do? Well, decision advantage. If it can help a decision maker, a policy maker, come to a better decision, that seems to be a yardstick for job well done. The difficulty with today is that we are living in this world of just a cascade of, we're drinking from a fire hose of information, including policymakers. And intelligence communities, Western intelligence agencies, US, British, I would just had the good fortune of being briefed by the Australian Secret Intelligence Service earlier today. Because there is now so much information available through commercial providers, outfits like Bellingcat. If you don't know Bellingcat, they are doing extraordinary reporting on Russian malign activities, all based on commercially available open source intelligence. This is forcing intelligence agencies really to, it's forcing them to say, what is the margin that we can deliver? And not least because policymakers are also reading those reports and they're saying, excuse me, like the New York Times is doing extraordinary reporting, Bellingcat's doing extraordinary reporting, what are you, CIA, doing? Now, I think that there is and there will continue to be a small, niche, but incredibly important role for example, traditional human intelligence. The best open source intelligence in the world will not get you what a leader like Putin or Xi, who don't write down things, don't send emails, very careful about not talking on the phone. Human intelligence, traditional espionage, the world's second oldest profession. I'll leave you to figure out what the first one is. That's still important, and it's going to be able to provide a margin when it's effectively done, even in this day of open source information.
Great. So we'll go to Mary right here.
Hi. You kept mentioning Soviet archives. Is one of those archives the Mitrokhin archive?
It is indeed.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So the Mitrokhin archive, we were just talking about it earlier, is an extraordinary story in of itself. Vasily Mitrokhin was the archivist for the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Directorate, the FCD. He decided in the late 1970s, looking at the records that were available to him, he was able to see how much of a lie was being propagated by the Soviet government about its past activities and what it was doing. And he decided to amass his own private collection and archive of records. Fast forward to the period when the Soviet Union was collapsing, I think just after the actual collapse, so like 92, he decided that this was the moment, as the borders were opening up, to bring his archive to the West. He tried the CIA first. The CIA thought, and I know the officer who turned him away, said, "This is too good. Can't be right." In fairness to the CIA, the embassies in Eastern Europe, it was in Estonia, were being inundated with people that were presenting themselves as genuine defectors. So anyway, Vasily Mitrokhin went down the road and tried the Brits, and the Brits said, "Yeah, we'll do this. This sounds great," and it became of operational value in the 1990s. It's the most complete archive of Soviet intelligence activities anywhere outside of the FSB or the SVR's own archives. And now portions of it are publicly available in Cambridge in the UK. It was the source of a pioneering book by my PhD supervisor, Christopher Andrew, and Vasily Mitrokhin in the late 1990s and early 2000s.
Okay, great. So we're going to go back to Zoom. Everybody else, think about your questions. Raise your hands, especially newcomers and students. All right, but first we're going to go to Zoom.
So this question is from Pamela Custer. Would you please speak about your analysis of the Havana syndrome that impacted State Department employees as well as others? 60 Minutes recently implicated Russia in a broadcast about this, though it appears that the official U.S. response doesn't seem to acknowledge that.
Yeah. Thank you. What an important question, and I'm really glad that someone asked it. My own view is that having seen the 60 Minutes and knowing some of the reporters that brokered that story, and then also interviewing people who are recently retired from the CIA, that there is a lot more to this story than we are publicly aware, and that I am reliably told by people who have been accurate in the past that there is compelling evidence that Russia is behind this. Well, first of all, that it is genuine. And that Russia is behind. For anyone that doesn't know, Havana syndrome is concerns the official name for them by the U.S. government is anomalous health incidents, unexplained health problems that U.S. officials, particularly intelligence officers, have experienced while stationed overseas. Many of these people are not people that you would think would be felled by any kind of headache, very alpha people, military backgrounds. There's a chilling, eerie pre-story to this, it seems to me, with the electronic surveillance that the Soviets conducted against the US Embassy in Moscow in the really from the 1960s, 70s. There's evidence to suggest that people who worked in the US Embassy in Moscow were afflicted with particular and a particularly acute type of cancer that was, some medical reports suggest, caused by the electromagnetic rays that Soviet technicians fired at the embassy in order to power listening devices and other things inside the US Embassy. There seems to me to be that chilling precursor to what we're seeing. And this is where it's such an important question, the really ugly and uncomfortable questions that this poses is, if Havana syndrome is true, why hasn't the US government done something more about it? And again, speaking to, interviewing people recently out of the CIA who I trust have said that the real answer is because it could constitute an attack on the United States and trigger an Article 5 NATO retaliation. And in other words, by not going there, they don't have to respond. This is the ugly reality, and I'm not one to believe in conspiracy theories, but these are coming from people that I trust wholeheartedly, who say that there is a lot more to it, and that in time the story will come out.
Okay, I am happy to take a question from Anna. And here comes a mic.
So 2 quick observations that I'd like to have your kind of response to. One is the third entity in the triumvirate that is intertwined in Russia between the security services and the organized crime is the Russian Church, the Orthodox Church, which has been used as a tool for spying and influence operations and so on and so forth. So I'd love if you could say a couple words about that. And the second question is, to what degree do you think, not exactly in the ideological but operational strategy of the Russian leadership, do you think the Primakov doctrine still applies, despite the fact that Primakov went against Putin and probably was bumped off? You know, we don't know for sure. Yeah. But anyway, I would love if you could comment on those 2 things. Yeah.
So the Russian Church and the FSB, as you said, the third part of the Putin state. I point you in the direction. It's now quite an old article, but it stood the test of time, by a colleague of mine called Julie Eltner, and she wrote a remarkable essay on Putin's spiritual security, looking at the role of the Russian Orthodox Church and the FSB in particular, and how Putin has hijacked and used the Orthodox Church for his own reasons, including intelligence operations. I think I'm right in saying that at the FSB, there is a Russian Orthodox altar. You can get the sacrament if you want at the FSB. You're in a different place than any kind of Western service. If you can go and get communion, I don't think you can do that in the FBI or in MI5. There's a fusion there, as you said, as your question, and it's. I think that it's only going to become more and more acute as the war in Ukraine continues. The Russian Orthodox leaders and Putin himself have now called this a holy war that Russia is fighting against the West. When you're armed with that kind of vernacular, I don't see that there are significant ways to de-escalate. The Primakov doctrine. What was your question? Sorry.
So the Primakov doctrine, in simplistic form, right? It constitutes the idea that strategically for the Soviet Union and then Russia, it makes sense to sort of if they're in a situation to sort of choose the path that oppose the West, particularly to oppose the U.S. And so insofar as this kind of mafiosi state, it does not really have a clear ideology, but they do have some operational principles. It seems like sometimes they still revert back to the Primakov doctrine in terms of choosing their strategy.
Yeah. We were lucky enough to host last week the recently retired U.S. ambassador to Moscow, John Sullivan, local Bostonian native, and he spoke on the record, so I'm happy to share. And there's a good write-up in the Harvard Gazette about his talk. And he was interacting, obviously, with the senior-most people, including Putin himself and Sergei Lavrov, and it is absolutely what he was saying, is that, you know, the meetings would, to a point, all start and go the same way, which is, isn't it absolutely terrible that the United States and Russia, two wonderful world powers, are at such loggerheads and at such all-time low, and that we represent two extraordinary civilizations? How can it possibly have come to this? And John Sullivan relaying, oh, well, this sounds, okay, we can maybe something to work with here. And then the conversation would go on, and then it would say, and the thing is, it is all your fault, the United States. So what are you, John, going to do about it? So the Primakov doctrine, blaming the United States for everything, seems to me to be alive and well in Putin. How much of it is rhetoric? We don't know. How much do they really believe in it? I think the last head of the KGB foreign analysis said, I mean, his working motto was, quote, blame everything on the United States and it will all be fine. And I think that continues on. Again, it's just impossible to disentangle in Putin's mind what is rhetoric and what he really believes in. Does he really believe that NATO is encircling Russia and that NATO is this aggressive actor, or is that rhetoric on his part? There's evidence, it seems to me, that it is actually just rhetoric. When Sweden joined NATO, Sweden of all countries, as far as I could tell, there was a really non-event response from Putin. It's something, it seems to be his rhetoric about NATO as it relates to Ukraine is really not so much about NATO, it's about Ukraine and his chauvinistic views of Ukraine and hard right Russian nationalism.
All right. Okay, we can do a mini question, but I definitely want to leave time for networking and buying books.
Great.
So let's go right here, and we'll do questions and answers in haiku. Okay.
Did we learn anything from the breakup of Germany, of East Germany, and then maybe anything from the breakup of the Warsaw Pact, or is that not as significant and impactful as the breakup of the Soviet Union?
Yeah. Did we learn anything? We absolutely did in real time as Germany, East Germany was collapsing. A massive priority for CIA at the time was knocking on doors and recruiting and finding the secrets of the former East German security service, the Stasi. And what did the CIA and close ally intelligence services discover? That all of the agents that they thought they were running against the East German security service were actually doubles. So they thought that they were controlling agents inside the Stasi, and they were all controlled by the Stasi themselves. Again, I interviewed one of the CIA officers whose job it was to knock on doors, and the absolute disillusionment within what they've been doing over the previous years and decades, just he could barely describe it. This was a extraordinarily sophisticated opponent, and it was actually much worse than they thought they were. So we did learn something, and it wasn't good.
Okay, and on that note, so please join me in thanking very much Calder Walton.